Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first of 3 virtual offerings in the Daemen College Speaker Series, hosted by Book Arts and led by faculty from Daemen College's exciting new Leadership and Entrepreneurship in the Arts program, dedicated to advancing leadership opportunities in the arts. My name is Nicole Cook, and I'm the Executive Director at the Western New York Book Arts Center. If this is your first time hearing about us, hello, and nice to meet you. We are an arts and cultural nonprofit located in the heart of downtown Buffalo's literary corridor, devoted to printing and book-related arts. That includes everything from letterpress and screen print to bookbinding, origami, calligraphy, and more. We are the only publicly accessible studio of our kind in Western New York, and we eagerly welcome all ages and skill levels to come and engage your creative curiosity. I'm joined today by our Education Director, Rosemary Williams, who will be running tonight's Zoom presentation and monitoring the chat. Please feel free and encouraged to ask questions at any point throughout tonight's event by typing in the chat box. Rosemary will interject as questions are raised, so your input will actually help to shape tonight's discussion. Don't be shy, but do please stay muted. Tonight's presentation is the first in a series of 3 workshops hosted by Book Arts in partnership with Daemen College as an introduction to their exciting new Leadership and Entrepreneurship in the Arts bachelor's degree program. Did you know that nationally, the arts and culture sector is an $878 billion industry and that the nonprofit sector accounts for 11.4 million jobs? We at Book Arts are strong proponents of workforce development in the creative sector, and Daemen's new program is such a unique opportunity for creatives working in a variety of media to sustain your practice as an independent business. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dan Shanahan. Dan Shanahan is Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurism and the Program Director at Daemen College, as well as co-founder and Artistic Director of Torn Space Theater. Dan received a BA in English Literature and an MA in Arts Management. Dan has directed more than 40 works for the stage and was awarded Best Director by the Art Voice 4 times. He was referred to in The Dramatist as the city's de facto king of site-specific performance, and The Atlantic referred to his work as a powerful example of the artist's role in reactivating and imagining new public spaces. His work has been written about nationally in PAJ, a journal of performance and art and chance magazine, and his production, They Kill Things, represented the US at the Prague Quadrennial in 2019. Recently, Dan launched Response, a performance series to bring leading contemporary performance to Western New York, developed a site-specific initiative at Silo City, and led a successful capital campaign to develop a contemporary performance center in the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood. Dan, please take us away.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have a lot of respect for your organization. I had an opportunity to tour it last year, and it's really fascinating to see the work that everyone is doing at Western New York Book Arts. So thank you so much for having me. So what I'll be doing today is giving a little bit of overview on grant writing, as well as taking kind of an artistic expression and formulating it within an organization. I'll give probably about a 25 minute talk. But what I'm hoping to do really is open up to questions, and that can happen either within my talk. You can throw questions into the chat or right afterwards. And that's going to help me, I think, better tailor the talk to the needs of the recipients. So, there are several avenues for an artist to move into the professional realm. One, you can work with an existing organization, or you can work with an agent, or you can create an online business to promote and sell your work. But today I'll be specifically speaking about how an artist can pursue grant writing in order to kind of move their career forward and how you can be targeted with your grants. And so I'll give some kind of insight and tips into that. The talk, again, will be a bit broad, so I'm hoping that the conversation chats will help narrow the focus specifically around your particular interests. So I'm going to share my screen and take you into a little presentation, and then we'll go from there. So the goal of this presentation, just give you a brief kind of overview of the organization that I founded and currently work within. And I hope that that will help highlight some of the particular points on grant writing. So when I started this company, I was very much a independent artist. I created Torrent Space as an artistic experiment and didn't necessarily have an intention to turn it into an organization, and certainly not a nonprofit that was going to be having to pursue grants, et cetera. But in order to sort of execute the art that I wanted to do, you need to have the actors, you need to have a functioning performance space, you need design elements, you need equipment, and obviously that requires funding. Also, you seem to have there's a limited window, I think, that you can sort of push your work through, really as an experiment. And then eventually either you sort of age out of that type of endeavor, or certainly people around you will start to have greater expectations on what they require in order to stay with your vision. And that usually means payment, right? And so you have to start thinking about how you can turn your endeavor into an organization. And so that's what I started to do. So in 2005, I transitioned the organization into a nonprofit, which then started to stabilize it and allow me to begin to pursue funding, because I knew that the way that I wanted to kind of move the work, it required that type of organizational structure. So even if you let's say you are an independent artist and you don't see yourself becoming an organization, I would still argue that you want to consider yourself through an organizational lens. And so as you probably are aware, nonprofits need to come up with a mission statement, and that's sort of a requirement in order to file your charter. But I really feel that the individual artists themselves should also be sort of creating a mission statement based upon their work. And I know many of you will have an artist statement, but I would encourage you to even kind of expand that into what I would call a mission statement. And in that, you start to articulate, what do you stand for as an artist? How are you moving the field forward within your specific discipline? Where do you fit within the historical lineage of your particular craft? And then start to really think of yourself as a sort of an organization which to promote. So how can you facilitate, to get, critical response about your work? How can that work become documented? Because what you're starting to do then, right, you're starting to build credibility for yourself, and that's going to really help kind of lead in to the funding relationship that we'll get into in a bit. So you actually start thinking of yourself in the third person, which sometimes could be a little counterintuitive, but I think it starts to have you gain a kind of a holistic approach to who you are as an artist and kind of where you fit within the professional context. So to expand that even further, as an organization, we started to identify what we call guiding principles, which is a sort of a further development of an organization. And again, even if you see yourself as an individual artist, I really think you can kind of go this route. So here are sort of 7 of them, and I'll just sort of quickly go through them throughout the presentation. And what guiding principles does for you as an artist is it starts to narrow the focus for where you're going to pursue funding opportunities and what types of partnerships you're going to be looking for. I think that one of the real dangers with the arts is that not you in particular, but we often start to pursue grants for their own sake. And that will often kind of twist you into like a pretzel, to where you start to quickly lose your focus as an artist or as an organization. The term is called mission drift, but I think that can happen to any of us if we just start to sort of pursue grants just for their own sake. And so having these guiding principles allows you to articulate the value of yourself as an artist, and then, as I said, narrow the focus for where you want to pursue your work. This is where we're located. We're located in the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood. And so I just sort of highlight some of the main assets in our neighborhood, like the Central Terminal and St. Stanislaus Church and the Broadway Market. And location matters, even regardless of whether you're an organization or an individual artist. So, what do you particularly mean to the artistic community that you align yourself with? How are you kind of moving that community forward? And how are you sort of actively contributing your art to kind of engage with the community in specific ways? And in addition, when you start to look at your funding sources, you want to think about, what do they have geographical priorities, and are you aligning with that? So here we are. One of the principles: encourage collective experience. This is this idea that, and it's kind of a buzzword now, but sort of creative placemaking. How can you create your artistic practice in order to bring more people into the table? Our idea is that, the digital realm is something that we're sort of rejecting, although I know we're on Zoom at this moment. But it's about thinking about, can performance sort of be these sort of collective public rituals where people can engage with it in very specific ways? And can we take people out of the traditional kind of art-based locations like a gallery or museum or a traditional theater, and start to bring people into sort of unexplored spaces? And so there's sort of a sense of adventure with the work, and that allows you, I think, to connect to people on different levels. So maybe a person isn't connecting to your work on a purely intellectual level. Maybe they're connecting to it in a visceral level, and that becomes yet another unique way in which to engage the public. And for us, sometimes it's actual performance. Sometimes it's thinking about communal meals as a way to think of performance, especially if there's like curated conversations and they're in a highly designed space. So highlight art in the everyday. This continues my theme of kind of thinking about yourself going beyond just your artistic discipline, and think about how you sort of engage with the wider community, however you want to define that. And that's sort of obviously a term that's going to be most appropriate to your particular practice. And so, this allows us all sorts of kind of interesting opportunities. So this particular image here, we were designing a large scale project at Silo City, and we had the funding for this particular project. So we wanted to integrate, a live helicopter into the performance. And we were able to have funding in order to do this, not because we were doing a particularly good job of describing our work, because I don't think the audience that we were trying to appeal to necessarily cared about the actual art. What we were doing was activating a space in Silo City, and in particularly a space that was on a major waterway. So in our own kind of contribution, we were helping waterfront development, and that was what the state was interested in. And so this will come into a theme I'll talk about in a little bit more, about really be very particular, specific about who your funding audience is and what are their priorities. And you have to speak their language. Otherwise, it's just not going to jive with them. And so this is, again, sort of highlighting art in the everyday. So what I also like to think about is how can I bring people into my kind of orbit who might not identify as an artist? And this becomes yet another way to kind of think about engaging community in unique ways. So what I like to do is find very unique skill sets, such here we have blacksmithers, and then sort of bring them into this public ritual that I'm creating. And I give them a space in which to do that. So I create a curated space that's based within an aesthetic framework, but I allow for enormous freedom from the sort of different community members that are engaging with the piece. And again, this is allowing us to kind of expand the way in which we view ourselves as a nonprofit. In this example here, this is an actual security firm. And this particular piece was done on the east side where we're located. So we hired a security firm that usually works on the east side. And we said, listen, we will pay you the same exact hourly rate that you would to guard a specific space that you normally would, but we're just asking you to guard these sort of these spots of light. And then we use that, and we extrapolated sort of data from the security system, security world, and we talked about themes of what is private space and what is secure space, and kind of how these spaces work. And so it had this kind of sort of more deeper sort of theoretical framework, but at the surface, there was essentially security guards guarding beams of light. And they liked this. They appreciated the sort of the thought that we were giving to it. And this would be someone that you normally would not think, I would assume, that would be working in a contemporary performance company, but it worked. And it was just yet another way to kind of engage different types of people. And this example here is me, again, just hiring straight labor, hiring union truck operators to engage in machinery in a public realm. Okay, reimagine works, don't rehash them. Again, this has to do with what I was saying about you considering your art within the larger conversation that's happening around you. So, are you an artist that's kind of keeping within a traditional mode? If that's the case, then that's going to sort of target and earmark where you're going to look for your funding. Us in the opposite elm, we're always, even if we're going to do classic works, we're going to find a way to deconstruct them, rehash them, and start to figure out different types of conversations that can happen around the work. Another big part, I think, of the individual artist is, or the organization, is you need to have a manifesto. Sort of what do you stand for, which is in addition to the guiding principles. So one of our manifestos is, complete belief in that there is no kind of specific way to cast a piece. So this particular image, this is from Harold Pinter, classic British author. Often is traditionally writes roles that are only cast for Caucasian men, usually with sometimes a female actress as well. Well, we just don't think that makes any sense anymore for us. So we'll just we cast regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and we assume that it's the audience's job to just figure it out, and that's just what we're going to do, and that's how they're going to confront our work, and that's what we stand for. Practice action, not just acting. Again, this is what I call a one-to-one relationship, and it's building a little bit off of what I said with the blacksmithers, but I'm always thinking about how I can bring in the actual community entity or skill set into the organization, and so that we can look at people's skill sets in different ways. And we just sort of change the context. So the previous slide was of boxers. This is of a high school marching band, etc. And then just sort of moving along, because I want to just give you a quick overview here. This is us facilitating progressive conversation. So we're always looking at what are the kind of conversations that are happening on a national or international level, and can we find performances or art practices that sort of highlight this. So this monologue was from an artist out of New York City who was taking a very traumatic experience in her life and kind of took ownership over it and made a performance piece around it. And it very much aligned with the Me Too movement. We often engage with politicians. So this is Crystal Peoples-Stokes. And we started thinking about, can we bring politicians into the kind of the larger conversation, as well as community leaders, and give them a forum and a platform. So again, it's you thinking about how can you use your art in different ways, but still stay true to what it is you stand for. So you're not sort of chasing, as I said, those grants. We're always trying to focus on the local, so nurturing local artists and giving them a platform in which to exist. And at the same time, we're also trying to and always look to become part of the wider national and international conversation. So we provide residencies to artists who are, we think, to be really at the forefront of contemporary performance, working both, as I said, nationally, or we'll bring in artists from Europe, et cetera, to kind of collaborate with us and our local team in order to create the work that we do. Okay, so that just gives you a little quick overview of the organization. And then what I want to do is spend just a couple minutes going into just a couple general tips and points for specifically grant writing that I hope will be useful for many of you here. So sort of some general tips. So, as you're thinking about the grant, the first thing I want to really stress is that you are going into a massively time-consuming endeavor that is going to be physically and intellectually straining. And so what I tell myself is that if I don't think I'm going to have a good chance at getting the grant, at sort of winning that battle, then I can't mentally put myself into that place. And so I go through a series of steps ahead of time in order to figure out if I think I have a good shot at it. And so I always research the funding criteria for the grant and ask myself, does my project actually align with it? Or am I going to have to shift and shape my project in order to fit in? And I'm always thinking, if that's the case, run away from it, because it's more important to stay true to who you are as an artist and an organization. Do you feel that this particular grant requires you to have a relationship with the funding agency? It's so important to have these personal relationships if you can get them. So if you can reach out to the funding agency ahead of time and say, listen, I just want to talk to you about this project. I'm interested in applying, but I'd love you to know a little bit more. Even something like that is enormously helpful so that when they're looking at that grant, they can start to put a face to it. Put yourself in the point of view of the person reading the grant. More often than not, they're overburdened and they're getting flooded with grants. So they're looking for any reason, I assume, just to throw it out. And so I'm always thinking to myself, this person doesn't really have a lot of time to read my grant, and they're looking for a way to get rid of it. And so always lead with strength up front with your grant so that you can get them to sort of be hooked into it and let them know that it makes sense for them to be reviewing it. And then, is there a rubric or scoring system that you think that the grant is basing your application for? And print that out. And then, when you're writing your grant, make sure that you're checking all those boxes so that you're fitting in with the right scoring system. Because again, a lot of times that's how they're going to be reviewing it. So again, as I said, these grants take enormous time. I just recently did an Empire neighborhood development grant. It took me over 80 hours, and it was for a larger grant. It was for 350,000, and I was not successful on that one. And so it's a punch in the stomach because you've committed this time, and so you try to limit that pain as much as you can, and try to really pick your shots. So generally what I do is I have probably about a 30 to 40% success rate with grants. And that's with me being very carefully considerate about whether I think I have a chance or not. Just a couple other tips. Be very aware of the deadline and make sure that you budget out the time for what's required of you. And then look at the grant ahead of time and look at all the attachments and requirements that you need to put in order, because it's likely that you're not going to know how to do all of them yourself. So let's say, for instance, there is a detailed budget that you need, and you need an accountant or someone to help you with it. Don't, obviously reach out to them right beforehand, lay that all out. And so you start to have those pieces already in place. Some of the more ambitious grants require oftentimes a common council member to sign off on. And so obviously you need to get ahead of that by a couple of weeks. And so you want to kind of start to play that out, because the worst thing, of course, is to get to the very end and then not have one or two attachments, and then your grants, null and void, and you've put in that 40 some odd hours in order to try to make it successful. And then once you sort of realize that this is the right grant for you, this is where I play sort of mental games with myself in order to do it. Again, just sort of picture you are essentially in like a white room by yourself with a computer screen, trying to fight your way through this puzzle. And so at this point, we will assume that you feel confident you can get it done. And then you take it on like a battle, and that becomes exciting. You're like, I'm going to win this. I'm going to win, and I'm going to pull this out. And I think that you have to kind of play these interesting mind games with yourself in order to stay with it. And again, I'm talking about, much of some of the larger funding grants. It's so crucial, again, because most of these grants are tied to specific word count or character count, that you have to be so concise and precise with your language. Again, don't use superfluous words. Try to avoid art speak, because more often than not, the reader is not going to be as sort of hip to your discipline specific as you are. And so you want to speak in sort of more broader terms. And then go from there, and then be very specific with the language you use. Then finally, we as artists have a very difficult challenge. The United States has a complicated relationship with how it funds arts and culture. It doesn't necessarily fund art for art's sake. It doesn't know how to judge it on its own particular merits. So it builds in metrics like educational value or neighborhood revitalization value or inclusivity, et cetera. Those things have metrics that can be measured. And so this is, again, the challenge about talking about your art so that it aligns with the priorities of the funder, but doesn't do in such a way that it dilutes who it is you actually are. It's very easy to explain why someone should fund a homeless shelter. It's very specific data. It becomes much more challenging to say, why should I fund a theater company, or why should I fund a literature company? These become much more complicated arguments, and you have to make sure that you have it in line to discuss it. And then finally, in closing, before I open up to questions, if you're starting out sort of early career, what I say is you're building your portfolio of grant funding. So you're looking for some low-hanging fruit. You're looking for those $1,500 to $5,000 grants that you think you can get. You want to get those, you want to fulfill the reporting requirements of the grant, and then you start building up your portfolio, and then you can start to kind of excel and move to the next stage. It doesn't happen overnight. And then in conclusion, Anderson Horowitz is a private American venture capital firm. And one of their co-founders, Ben Horowitz, discussed this magic bullet syndrome, saying that when a company gets in a rough patch and the ship is sinking, people go into this intense brainstorming session where they think they can get a magic bullet to solve the problem. He says, instead, you need tons of lead bullets to sort of toss at the problem. You just have to work harder. You have to grind it harder. You have to make more sales calls. And I really think that's the position that many of us as artists are right now. When you're looking for that funding, it's not always going to be that silver bullet. It's that slow, kind of sloggy work to start to build up your portfolio of grant funding, and then you can start to expand from there. So I took that talk almost exactly to the duration I wanted, which was about 26 minutes. So good job, Dan. And now I will happily open up to questions and start having a conversation with all these chats that I see coming in. All right, let's get to it.
Yeah, Dan, we have a lot of great questions, and thank you for everyone for popping them in the chat. I'll start with this one. Curious as to some things you would encourage artists not to do on their funding applications. And then as a follow-up from someone else, when does it make sense perhaps to hire your own grant writer or someone to write the grant for you?
Yeah, so the what not to do again is to start to bring in information that's not relevant to the funding criteria. So less is more, I think, with grants. You don't have to use all the word count. I'm sure the reader is happy if you don't. And what not to do is just use hyperbole. It just goes nowhere. Enriching souls doesn't mean anything to someone who's reading it. Saying that my program is going to provide access to poetry to 1,500 at-risk students means something. That's an actual metric that you can be judged upon. So that's what you shouldn't do is not use specific language. The thing with the grant funding, the grant writer, a good grant writer is going to cost between $75 and $140 an hour. And so if you're in the position to do it, it's a good thing to do it, right? Because all of us have got into this profession not to write grants, but somehow we write grants a lot. And I'm seeing claps on that because right? It's not what we chose to do, but here we are doing it. So if you can get the organization or you can get your position in a way that can be justifiable, then excellent. You have to assume though that the grant writer is also, even a good grant writer is going to be a 30 to 40% hit, meaning success rate. So you have to be prepared to put money out there and not necessarily get a return. And so if you're comfortable with that, and that makes sense for you financially, that's very helpful. It might even be helpful in the beginning just to use that as what you call startup costs for your business. Again, artist as entrepreneur, and say this is a necessary cost. This is going to help me get that grant writing sort of repertoire up and running, and it's money well spent. But it is money, and it is a significant hourly that you're going to be shelling out.
Okay. And follow up to that, then, how long have you been writing grants, and do you remember how long it took you to get your first award?
Yeah, yeah. So when we got our nonprofit, that's sort of when we were able to start writing grants. Um, I was getting some very small grants, meaning under 10,000, and I did not get my first significant grant until like 2007. So I had already been working at it for some time, and the reason why that grant of size happened was because the artistic programming began to mean something to a wider audience. And what that project was, it excuse me, the central train terminal was just reopening to the public. And I was the first one invited in to design a public installation that was going to kind of reintroduce the terminal to the wider community after it was stabilized. And so that allowed me to get that first kind of larger grant. And so that's how that happened, and that was at a higher state level. And that's something I was going to bring up. It's about, again, these relationships. That's why it becomes very challenging for an artist in Buffalo oftentimes to be getting to go after those national grants, because it's kind of, do you have the sort of the profile at this point to go after them? And so if you don't think that's the case, then again, you start to build out your strategy and say, okay, if I'm going to start with a local, then I can maybe get a higher end state grant because the funding is going to be bigger if I fit with their priority. And then if you get one of those high end state grants in your books, that you can use that as leverage to then go apply to a national grant and say, listen, I got to this point, and so now I've proven myself. And that's kind of what that's doing. It's vetting you, and it's allowing the other funders to start looking and saying, okay, this person's for real. They can play at this game.
Yeah, it's like building blocks. You got to start from somewhere small, and then you get the national grants.
Mhm.
One question that Emily had, it was a little bit earlier on in the talk. I don't know if it's particular to grants, but what's been the most powerful tool in your skill set for being able to navigate such a challenging year for artists and performing arts? Speak to that to grants or to the organization, or just how you guys have, figured out pandemic wise how to keep going.
Two things. One, we were in a good position because the way that we view performance doesn't necessarily restrict us to doing inside sort of text-based work. And so we were able to, I think we were the first organization to do live performance during the pandemic, and because we were fortunate enough to have Silo City as a place that we work in residency at. And so that affords us with quite a bit of space. And we can create these sort of larger open scale rituals that provide us with it. The two other things that allowed us to navigate this, one is that we're fortunate enough to have a really good support system of individual donors, artists that we work with, and some foundations that we have good relationships with. And they did two things for us. They both gave us emergency funding, and they wrote contracts with us so that we weren't required to fulfill the project grants that year. So they extended it, by 12 to 18 months. And so they were extremely just judicious about that. So this ties back to those relationships that I would recommend people having. It just pays such dividends to have these personal relationships with your larger support staff. And then the final thing that really helped us was that we have a very good relationship with our site on the east side that we work with, and we just happen to be going into a capital campaign. And so we would have been closed anyways because of construction. And so it just sort of happened that we were already planning to close for indoor performances. And then unfortunately the pandemic happened, but we would have not been doing indoor performances regardless of the situation. So those three things allowed us, I think, to come out, at least to this point, in good shape.
And then another quick question. Where do you find out about the majority of the grants? Like, is it just through word of mouth, through like an online sort of site, or foundations in the area?
So I would, if you're an individual artist, ASI, run by Jen Swan, who's also an adjunct at Daemen College, is an absolutely incredible resource. One of their staff members, Holly Grant, does a really nice job of sort of filtering through all the noise of grants so that it can become very targeted. Because again, if you sort of type in grants, state grants, federal grants, art grants, it's just sort of this overwhelming amount of information, and it's too much, and it's useless. And so I think by looking at what I call these sort of gatekeepers of the information, so you have ASI is a great one, and then you have the Community Foundation of Western New York as well. And so that starts to become these targeted places for you to look at. Those are two. And then the other one I would suggest is, and this is actually more of a strategy, is again, depending on your discipline, start to look at one or two kind of leaders within that sector, within your particular geographical location, and ask them where to look for. Because again, unless you have a really good sort of repertoire, there's probably no chance, honestly, that you're going to get a national grant anyways. And so you really want to start at that local level. And so it starts to become a much more filtered, targeted search.
Thanks, Dan. I think that was the end of the questions in the chat, but I'm sure we'll have more a little bit later. I'd love to pass it over to the Nicole, who has been feverishly typing in love of all the comments you're making and adding her own. So let me pop that over to Nicole, if you don't mind, and then we'll bring us all back together at the end for more questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Dan, I'm feverishly typing the whole time because you're saying so many things that I wish I knew when I first got into grant writing, which is why I made it a point to say, I hope everyone's writing this down. I feel like you're really bringing an inside perspective and, frankly, laying out some stuff that people don't always talk about or talk about openly. So I really appreciate your candidness and your, especially emphasis on the fact that grants are not always a good fit for individual artists if they don't have the resources to commit up front. So I think that's a really excellent takeaway for everyone today. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to be brave and use Zoom and a PowerPoint at the same time. All right. So thank you again, Dan. I really loved your point about narrowing your focus and aligning your priorities. I think that's really excellent advice for independent artists or for anyone who's interested in potentially forming an organization. I think that kind of coalition building is really important for the arts sector at large. And I think it's also something that we at Book Arts, believe pretty strongly and try to put in action every day. So if you've never been to the Western New York Book Arts Center, this is a photo of our humble abode at the corner of Washington and Mohawk. The Leadership and Entrepreneurship in the Arts degree program at Daemen College is centered around the notion that artists themselves are small businesses. And so it offers classes like that are often lacking in creative degree tracks on topics such as financial marketing and management. So for instance, Dan mentioned working with an accountant. Many independent artists don't realize that they might need help supporting their finances. So that's the kind of information that we love to hear being brought into the more contemporary conversation about artists as entrepreneurs. Generally speaking, there are three primary routes for artists to earn income at Book Arts, and that's typically through selling their goods on a consignment basis in our retail space, teaching classes and workshops, or exhibiting in one of our two galleries. First and foremost, though, we offer support and development opportunities to prepare artists for any one of those endeavors. For example, artists who are interested in selling in our retail shop, they don't always have the merchandise ready to go, right? Most people require assistance with printing, packaging, pricing their work, and oftentimes people who create pieces of art don't even realize everything that goes into marketing and selling them until it's time to do so, and then it can be a little bit overwhelming. So we strive to create opportunities like tonight's event that help to educate our artist community and our creative workforce about opportunities that are out there for them to reach both their creative and entrepreneurial goals. Our communications and shop director, pictured here on the screen, but also present today on the Zoom, Melissa Reckon. She meets with each consignment artist before they begin selling with us to review their merchandising and marketing and help to make sure that they achieve the best possible sales success. Our consignment split rate is one of the most competitive in Buffalo because we believe in supporting the individual artist. As of 2020, we began selling consignment goods both in-store and online. This way, artists can maximize their sales potential without the lofty overhead of owning and operating a store. Anyone who's ever been even briefly involved in retail or even run so much as an Etsy shop knows that there's an awful lot that goes into the front and back end of those transactions. More recently, Melissa has started a design licensing program as well as a shop residency where artists can gain more experience designing and printing merchandise for retail sale while earning revenue for their work without necessarily ending up with large upfront costs for materials or excess inventory common in retail sales. This is also a really great way for artists to sort of dip their toe into the idea of participating in a retail space if they're not exactly sure that it's right for their product or their service. And the same is true for teaching artists and exhibiting artists. We really make an effort to meet them where they are in terms of skills and experience and suggest an appropriate track that we think will best serve their development as an independent artist. For example, an artist who wishes to have a gallery exhibition but maybe doesn't have a robust body of work already created might be better suited to our new residency program. This provides 3 months of studio time and technical assistance, but then culminates in an exhibition. So it's a process that takes place over time rather than just putting all of the expectations on the artist to be prepared. There might be a situation where a more confident and more established artist is ready to go. They've got their body of work, their artist statement, they're ready to publish. And in that case, we would invite them to exhibit in our upstairs level gallery, which features, a much larger amount of space and also a longer amount of time. This body of work that you're viewing right now is by emerging artist Nicholas Stokes, who was our resident artist in 2020. And almost each piece that you see here was sold during the exhibition. The show earned him a number of paid commissions, and it garnered the attention of another gallery in Rochester, so he's continuing to exhibit using this event as a springboard for his career. We're really excited for Nicholas, and frankly, we hope he's just the first of many who get to participate in this program and use it as an opportunity to kind of shake off the nervousness of their first exhibition. Similarly, an artist might have an interest in teaching a skill related to their medium of expertise, but they might not have the experience writing a lesson plan or speaking to a group. Pictured here is an artist who teaches calligraphy and began running classes at Book Arts, which is great because she has access to not only our space and our technical assistance, but also our audience and our marketing reach. Teaching these days is now even more complicated because we're teaching over Zoom, like all of us here today, as well as in the classroom when safety guidelines determine that it's appropriate. At Book Arts, we just started running in-person programs again in April, and we've done so with great success and very careful adherence to New York State forward safety guidelines. But it stands to reason that the learning curve is steeper than ever, and so we want to make sure that we are available to artists who have the know-how for their skill set, but maybe not the way to translate it onto the digital screen. Trying to work with your hands and run a camera at the same time is very challenging. So in terms of grant funding, Book Arts also contracts with artists to run programs. So for instance, our Printing Partners program, which takes printing out of the shop and into the community by offering free workshops at neighborhood community centers, we hire teaching artists on an independent contractor basis to fulfill those roles. This arrangement allows us to keep costs down, which helps to provide the workshops completely free of charge for community centers and families who participate, while paying the artists a fair wage and enabling artists to remain independent so they can focus on their own art making. Finally, we are the only letterpress and screen print studio outside of a university setting in Western New York where you can come in, take a few classes, and then work independently to make your own prints and artwork. Access to specialized tools and equipment are really important for artists to be able to produce their work, but so is a network of artists and simply the experience of being around others. This is something that we were hearing quite a lot during the COVID era when our studios were not accessible, is that people were just missing the feeling of community and the opportunity to kind of bounce ideas off of each other. With that in mind, we've also created new programs that don't necessarily require people to learn letterpress from start to finish. So we have options like guided open studio. We offer full custom printing. We invite people to come in and partake in the process. We've changed some of our classes so that they're a shorter form so people can sort of, try out letterpress and see if it's a good fit for them. And I think what's so exciting about all of this is that it's continually creating new opportunities for working artists, because the more the public is interested in engaging with new art forms like letterpress, the more we're able to hire on an independent contractor basis, teaching artists who have those specialty skill sets. And then one last note is that the Book Arts Center does engage with a grant writer. We are fortunate to contract the services of Kathy Kiernan. There is a really excellent blog post about her that Melissa wrote that's up on our website presently. We'll drop the link in the chat at some point. But I wanted to just kind of follow up on Dan's point that grant writers are a financial investment. And so you want to be careful when you think about sort of how much is it costing you upfront to engage with a grant writer versus what is the potential award that you're going to earn. And I can tell you based on my experience that it takes time to start earning bigger and more awards. So working with a contractor like Kathy is really great because she offers us opportunities where, you know, if we can only afford for her to kind of read over an application and see what her thoughts are, and she sends back notes once, that's great. And then over time, as we've started to become more successful with the awards that we are winning, we've been able to bring her in for help on more larger scale projects and some reporting. So you don't necessarily have to go all in on a grant writer right away. If you feel like there's a way that you can benefit, you can often reach out and ask if they can kind of meet you in the middle with a smaller product that they can offer you as an interim idea.
Nicole, I had a little question for you. It reminded me too when Dan was mentioning ASI and the individual artist grants. I know, and I don't know how much you can speak to this, but I've sat on a NISCA panel before, New York State. Well, that was a lot and a lot of grant reading. And I wasn't looking for ways to, not fund people, as Dan said, but I wanted to make sure I was doing my due diligence and really making sure that the grants hit the metrics. But you sat on a panel with ASI, right? Can you speak a little bit to your experience with that?
Yeah, I sat on a panel for a DEC grant, which is a decentralization grant through NISCA, and that is support for independent artists. I thought it was really interesting because there were so many exciting ideas, but there were so many incomplete applications. And so what that says to me is that people are unaware of the resources that are available to them for help with grants. I mean, ASI is a really excellent resource, and we're very fortunate to have them in our community because independent artists can reach out to them and say, I'm writing this DEC grant and I'm not sure, for instance, how to write my marketing plan. And then they, can work with someone at ASI to maybe read a sample or maybe ask someone to review theirs. And I can tell you that a lot of the other arts organizations in Buffalo would be willing to help too. Many of us exist for the purpose of advancing the arts and supporting independent artists. So if you shoot us over a question, we can probably point you towards a helpful resource. I think that, there are just things about grants where they only exist in the grant world. So for instance, artists don't usually have to think about matching funds, right? There's a lot of grants where if you're asking for $1,000, the grant maker also expects you to raise $1,000. So you have to think about how exactly you're going to do that. And if your response is, I'm going to hold a raffle. Okay, well, that's a good idea, but how? You always want to make sure that you're elaborating on it and showing the grant maker that you really do have a plan. Maybe you have a community partner in mind for that raffle. Maybe the raffle is going to be your artwork and it's going to serve as publicity for this project. You want to Dan's point, this person has been reading, 10, 15, 20 grants. How do you stand out? How do you make it seem like you're the one who's got it together and is prepared to execute? I think that's my biggest takeaway from that, is that there are a lot of times where I felt like it was an excellent idea. And I think that they did know what they were talking about, but they didn't necessarily elaborate in a way that convinced me that they were ready to act.
Thanks, Nicole. Let's see, I'm monitoring the chat. I don't see any other questions, but if folks want to pop their questions in, please do. I know that Nicole and Dan could probably talk about grants until I go to bed tonight. So.
Yeah. Trying to think, Dan, what else can we share with folks who might be interested in learning about funding?
I think the other, we're referencing grants again. If we're focusing mostly on the individual artist, again, it's important to say that because of funding kind of laws and guidelines within the United States, it is very challenging for the individual artist to file directly. So this is where organizations like ASI become very important, or if you can find another large organization that would act as a pass-through for your funding. So it essentially becomes a fiduciary kind of hold for your funding, and then they would pass the money on to you, because they would be the 501c3 or nonprofit that can absorb the funding and then pass it on to you. Those are the types of opportunities I think that are going to increase your chances. So for instance, New York State Council on the Arts, one of the larger state funding organizations for artists, has a very limited individual artist grant, and that has to go through a larger organization. So that is the unfortunate reality for the independent artists, is that it becomes a difficult challenge to find appropriate grants that you can apply for directly.
I just popped the NISCA, New York State Council on the Arts thing in the chat, as well as all the other organizations that we've been talking about too. You should see all those links popped in the chat too. And
then if I can build on, so I don't want to leave on such a pessimistic tone there. What you can do though is, again, let's just use NISCA as an example. On their menu, it lists all of the program coordinators for whatever discipline you're going into. And they are very accessible, so you can call them and say, I don't know of a pass-through agency that is appropriate for me. Can you suggest them? So for instance, that first large grant that we received at the Central Terminal was actually passed through an organization called the Experimental Television Center. And so they found that link for us. So there is a way to kind of facilitate these relationships. And it sometimes is as simple as reaching out to one of these program coordinators to find that appropriate match for you.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice in general, is if you don't know, ask. I think as you're going through, whether you're trying to find a grant or fill out a grant, or, maybe you need a financial report that you're not familiar with, there's always going to be someone out there that has that information that you should tag in if you can, because I think you're always going to build a stronger app if you start to, amass a team, basically. I mean, I know for me, I now can't get through a grant application for the state without our grant writer and our accountant. So I just always would say, if grants are something that you're going to seriously pursue, you should just make sure that you have the informational resources available to you. And if you don't, seek them out. I think that's my greatest piece of advice.
Thanks, Nicole. That's good advice. And then Dan, before I bring it back over to Nicole for closing us out here tonight, did you want to speak a little bit more about the LEA program and how this all sort of meshes with the grants and what we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Waterhouse, who is the chair of the Department of Visual and Performing Arts, and myself, along with support from Jen Swan from ASI, among others, felt that there was a real need in the Western New York community to bring professional skill sets and more of an entrepreneurial lens to individuals who are interested in the arts. And I can absolutely sort of put myself in the shoes of a kind of an early career artist. I think that us as early career artists are often sort of struck by where to go next and what kind of logical step do we need to take in order to create a sort of a professional organizational path for ourselves. And so this program is intended to kind of fill that gap, while also saying art leaders also need to have a deep appreciation for the liberal and fine arts. And so the program is looking for that balance so that a student can both acquire the foundational knowledge that you get through the liberal and fine arts, so you have an actual appreciation for the discipline that you're going into and the relationships you're going to have with the artist, but then also start to have a strategic sort of professional skill-based knowledge that you're going to get through entrepreneurship classes and some of the great classes that we offer in the business department at the college. And so it's looking to find that merger of those two disciplines. And then we're doing that all within the backdrop of what we believe to be an absolutely dynamic arts and cultural scene in Western New York. And so we have a lot of good partnerships with leaders in the community, and we want to start bringing those types of professionals onto campus, so there starts to become greater dialogue between the student, the art professional, and the two disciplines talking to each other as well.
Yeah, I know when we were looking, when we were chatting with you all, I was like, oh, where was this program when I was an undergrad? It's so wonderful. We were all like, this is perfect for what we wanted to go into, but we didn't know it at the time. So it's great to be able to do this and learn more.
No, that's great. We've been hearing that a lot, and that just it sort of validates that we're on the right path with this. So I do appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, it's definitely melding the arts with community mindedness and just advancing everything. So thanks. I'm fangirling, but I'll bring it over to Nicole now.
No, I feel the same way. I had the same thought, and I think it's just such an excellent service to the creative workforce. And I, hope to see more programs like this popping up. But I think it's exciting to me that Daemen is the renegade, combining arts and business. So with that, we are right at time. So I'm going to close us out. So I wanted to just say thank you everyone so much for attending our first of 3 virtual offerings in our Daemen College Speaker Series. This is hosted by Book Arts and led by faculty from Daemen College's Leadership and Entrepreneurship in the Arts program, dedicated to advancing leadership opportunities in the arts. We have 2 more upcoming sessions, Marketing Skills for Artists and Branding Skills for Artists. And if you don't know the difference between those 2, definitely make sure you tune in. So be sure to visit our website and sign up for those workshops. Plus, there's a great blog post on Book Arts grant writer Kathy Kiernan available for you to check out on our website and learn a thing or two from an expert. We also encourage you to sign up for our email list and stay up to date on all of Book Arts artist opportunities. We have a whole secret batch of announcements coming out in early May, so you're definitely going to want to stay tuned. And finally, just please keep an eye on your email for a survey. Following the end of this event, we're going to send out a questionnaire, and everyone who fills out the survey will receive a coupon code for 10% off in our online shop, as well as be entered to win a giveaway for a Book Arts membership. So keep an eye out for that. We are so grateful for your attendance today and your input in the email later on. Have a great evening, everyone.